Everyone laughed at the woman who buried her flower. She was the only one who ate that winter. Every culture, every civilization that has survived the harshest seasons of human history has survived because someone in that community listened to the old stories. Someone paid attention when the grandmothers spoke of cycles, of patterns, of preparation measured not in weeks, but in years. The Great Plains in 1890 were unforgiving in ways that modern people can scarcely imagine. Winter didn't just inconvenience settlers. It killed them. It froze them. It starved them. And yet, in a small settlement in Nebraska, a woman would do something so unusual, so contrary to the conventional wisdom of her time, that her own community would mock her relentlessly. Her name was Lenora Hollis, and she was about to prove that the old ways, the old knowledge, had been right all along. The story of how knowledge passes through generations is older than written history itself. In the old countries of Northern Europe, in the valleys of Scandinavia, and the cold corners of Ireland, people developed ways to survive months of absolute scarcity. They learned which seeds to save, how to cure meat, how to seal grain against moisture and rodents, how to bury food deep enough that the frost would preserve it forever. When families immigrated to America, they brought these traditions with them, but many settlers abandoned them as soon as they could. The frontier, they believed, was different. America was different. There was always more land, more resources, more abundance than anywhere in the Old World. The cycles of feast and famine that had dominated European winters seemed irrelevant in a new country with endless supplies arriving on trains. But the old knowledge that Lenora Hollis possessed didn't come to her from her own people. It came from her grandmother, who had spent 40 years watching the weather patterns of the Great Plains. Her grandmother had noticed something that escaped most settlers' attention. Every 20 or so years, the winter would arrive early and stay late, bringing cold and snow that seemed to last through spring. The supply trains would stop running. Flour couldn't be brought in from Kansas City. Salt pork and preserved goods would run out, and families would begin to die of starvation while sitting in their own homes surrounded by snow. Lenora had been 16 when her grandmother called her to her bedside and explained this pattern, explained how to read the signs of an especially harsh year approaching, and taught her the old methods of preservation her family had used for hundreds of years. "The ones who laugh at you now will beg at your door," her grandmother had whispered, her Irish accent still thick after 50 years in America. "But you remember this. You store deep. You store sealed. You store out of sight. And when the real hunger comes, you'll be the only one with grain in your belly." Lenora was now 37 years old, and she had been watching the patterns of the sky for more than 20 years. She had kept her own careful records, noting the first frost, the depth of the snow, the direction of the winter winds. And in early 1889, she had noticed something that made her blood run cold. The signs were wrong. The patterns were shifting toward something terrible. The way the corn was growing, thin and struggling despite good soil. The way the birds had begun to gather in unusual numbers in the fall. The way the sky took on a peculiar color in the evenings, a kind of reddish cast that her grandmother had always said preceded the worst winters. Lenora had said nothing to her husband, Samuel, about this feeling. Samuel had died in 1887, just 2 years before, from a fever that had come on suddenly in the spring. She had 3 children who depended on her: Thomas, who was 15, Martha, who was 13, and little Samuel Jr., who had just turned 9. She had a small homestead, 80 acres that Samuel had filed claim to before his death, and it was hers to keep and work as long as she could manage it. The question was how to prepare for what she believed was coming without her children thinking she had lost her mind. It was late April of 1889 when Lenora began her first preparation. She brought Thomas and Martha into the small barn behind their homestead and explained to them what their great-grandmother had taught her. "We're going to prepare," she said quietly. "More than usual. More than we've ever done." Thomas, who had his father's skeptical nature, looked at her with confusion. "Prepare for what?" "Mother, the crops came in good last year. We're not poor. Why would we need extra?" But Martha, who had something of her grandmother's intuition, understood. She had seen her mother's careful observations, her journal of weather patterns, the way she studied the evening sky. "Because you think this winter will be bad," Martha said simply. "You think it will be worse than usual." Lenora nodded. "Worse than the settlers have experienced here. Worse than anyone's seen since they've been here. We need to prepare as if the supply lines will stop, as if the general store will be empty, as if we're going to be entirely on what we can produce and preserve right here." The work of preparation consumed the entire summer and fall of 1889. Lenora took the money she had been saving since Samuel's death, money she had earned selling butter and cheese to neighbors and to the general store in town. She spent it at first on bulk grain from the feed merchant who passed through the settlement with his wagon twice a month. Then she bought flour, barrel after barrel of it, from the general store run by Thomas Underwood. Underwood had asked her why she needed so much, but he had never been one to turn down profit, so he had helped her load barrel after barrel into her wagon. Next came the special supplies she needed: salt, which was expensive but essential; beeswax from a beekeeper 3 settlements over; clay pots of various sizes; tools for digging. She spent much of June preparing the burial sites, deep holes dug below the frost line, lined with clay that she mixed herself from the earth of her property, sealed with beeswax, and covered with wooden lids, sealed further with pitch. It was exhausting work, and her hands became raw from digging, from handling the salt, from the constant labor. By midsummer, the entire settlement had begun to notice what Lenora Hollis was doing. She was visible in town every market day, buying supplies in quantities that seemed excessive. She was asking unusual questions about preservation, about which foods kept the longest, about old methods of keeping grain. The general store owner's wife, Rebecca Underwood, began to gossip. "That Hollis woman is behaving like a madwoman," Rebecca said to the other wives who gathered at the well and at market. "Buying flour like she's got 10 families to feed. And those strange pots. What is she doing with all those pots?" By late summer, the questions had turned to rumors, and the rumors had spread. People began to offer their opinions about why Lenora Hollis was buying so much. Some thought she was trying to start a business and sell flour to neighboring settlements. Others suggested she had received money from somewhere questionable. Perhaps she had a wealthy relative in the East who had died and left her an inheritance she wasn't telling anyone about. A few of the more generous-minded people simply thought she was being foolishly wasteful, preparing for a disaster that would never come. This is where James Cade enters the story. James Cade was the town elder, the man who had led the settlement's founding committee, who had claimed the land and surveyed it for the original settlers. He was in his 60s, weathered and commanding, and he had the authority that came from being one of the first to arrive in the region. He had also survived 2 harsh winters in his 40 years on the frontier. Hard winters, certainly, but winters that the town had managed to survive by working together and rationing carefully. James Cade believed that he understood the frontier, that he had learned what it took to survive, and that anyone who suggested they needed to do more preparation than what the settled, coordinated approach of the community required was essentially questioning his judgment and his leadership. When James Cade heard about Lenora Hollis and her excessive buying and strange preparations, something in him bristled with irritation. Who did this widow think she was? suggesting that the standard preparations the community made were insufficient, hoarding supplies like a miser while other families were struggling. When he mentioned his concerns at the town council meeting in late August, he framed it not as an attack on Lenora, but as a concern about community stability. "There's a woman in our settlement," he announced, loud enough for the entire gathered room to hear, "who is buying up supplies in a way that suggests she doesn't trust our ability to support ourselves as a community. She's hoarding grain, hoarding flour, preparing like we're facing the end of the world, and I'm concerned about what message this sends to the younger people here, the newer families. Are we to believe we should all be hoarders? That we can't trust each other? That the old ways of community cooperation and mutual support are finished?" The room had murmured in agreement. Several of the merchants and farmers had nodded, and no one had stood up to defend Lenora Hollis, because standing up to James Cade on matters of settlement philosophy was not something people did lightly. The confrontation that Lenora had been dreading came 2 weeks later. The town had organized a community meeting to discuss winter preparations, a chance for the settlers to come together and plan their collective response to the coming cold season. It was the 3rd week of September, and the mornings were already frosting. Lenora had intended to slip in late and leave early, but she had not anticipated what was about to happen. She had barely sat down in the back of the community hall when James Cade stood and pointed directly at her. "Lenora Hollis," he said, his voice carrying the weight of his authority and years. "Perhaps you would be willing to explain to the community why you have seen fit to hoard supplies in a way that concerns some of us about your understanding of our collective welfare." The room went silent. All eyes turned to Lenora. She felt her face flush, felt the heat of shame and anger rising in her chest. Her hands clenched in her lap, she stood slowly, her legs slightly unsteady beneath her. "I am preparing," she said quietly, her voice not carrying as far as she would have liked. "As I believe any prudent person prepares." "Preparing for what?" James Cade pressed. "For a disaster that everyone else believes will never happen, suggesting that our planning is insufficient, suggesting that the good people of this community cannot provide for themselves?" "I am preparing," Lenora said, more clearly this time, "for what I believe the patterns of weather suggest is coming. I have studied the signs, the way the sky behaves, the way the crops grew this year, the records of severe winters. I believe we are facing a harsh season, and I want to ensure my children are provided for." The room erupted in crosstalk, some voices supportive, most dismissive. "Patterns?" one of the farmers called out. "You think you know better than men who farmed this land for 40 years? "The sky," another voice mocked. "She's reading omens in the sky like a fortune teller." James Cade held up his hand, and the room quieted. "I respect your grandmother's wisdom, Lenora," he said, and his tone suggested that this respect was a courtesy he was extending, despite what he really thought. "But this is America now, not the old country. We have railways, we have trade networks, we have each other. The days of preparing for a single settlement's complete isolation are long past. What you're doing looks to me like fear, and fear spread through a community can cause real harm, real division." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "I would ask you to reconsider the message you're sending to the younger families here. I would ask you to think about what your hoarding might mean for the trust and cooperation that holds us all together." With that, he sat down, and several people applauded. Lenora stood for another moment feeling utterly exposed, utterly mocked, and then she sat down and didn't say another word for the rest of the meeting. She left as soon as it ended, her children following her out into the cool September evening. Martha walked beside her, silent, her jaw clenched. Thomas hung back, embarrassed to be associated with his mother's visible shame. Young Samuel took her hand, not understanding what had happened, but sensing that something bad had occurred. "He's a fool," Martha said quietly as they walked toward their homestead. "And so is everyone who agreed with him." "Hush," Lenora said, not out of any desire to defend James Cade, but from a kind of bone-deep weariness. "They believe what they believe. We'll do what we know is right." But that night, alone in her room after the children had gone to sleep, Lenora wept. She wept for the foolishness of people who didn't listen. She wept for the loneliness of being right when no one believed you. And she wept because she knew, with absolute certainty now, that when the disaster came, and it would come to people she had tried to help, people she lived among and cared about. It would come to people who had mocked her. If you're enjoying this story, hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what happens next. The ridicule didn't stop after the town meeting. If anything, it intensified. Lenora became the subject of whispered conversations at market, the butt of jokes at the general store. The farmer who had spoken up about weather patterns approached her at the feed merchant's visit in early October and asked, with barely concealed mockery, if she wanted to buy even more flour, since she seemed to have such expert knowledge about what was coming. She had ignored him and completed her purchase of salt with dignity. But the isolation began to affect her children. Thomas, being 15 and already sensitive to his position in the settlement, became withdrawn and defensive. He started spending more time alone, or with other boys whose fathers had made pointed comments about the Hollis widow and her foolish preparations. Martha, on the other hand, became her mother's stalwart ally. She helped with the final burying of the sealed crocks in late October, digging alongside her mother, carrying heavy loads of grain, and speaking not a word of doubt or complaint. Young Samuel, at 9, was largely insulated from the cruelty of adults, but he picked up on his mother's stress and became quieter himself, less eager to play with other settlement children. The work of preparation intensified as fall deepened. Lenora had completed her initial burying in early October, but she continued to think about what might be needed, what additional items might sustain her family if her worst predictions came true. She purchased dried beans, every pound she could afford from the few sources available. She bought dried apples and dried plums from a traveling merchant who came through in mid-October. She requested eggs from neighbors who raised chickens, pickling them in salt and storing them in sealed jars. She purchased a side of preserved pork from a farmer who had more than he needed, paying premium prices to ensure it was properly cured and would last. She had a blacksmith in a neighboring settlement make her additional metal containers and lids. She traded 2 of her milk cows for salt, an extraordinarily expensive trade that raised eyebrows throughout the community. By late October, Lenora had buried more than 2 tons of various preserved foods in her prepared pits, each one sealed with layers of beeswax, pitch, and clay, buried deep enough that the frost would never reach them. She had also created a secondary storage system in her cellar, filling it with all the non-perishable goods she could acquire. Her money was nearly gone. She had spent nearly everything she had saved and had sold off non-essential livestock to raise additional capital. If she was wrong about what was coming, she would face a winter of privation herself. But something in her, the same instinct that had made her listen to her grandmother, the same careful attention to patterns that had guided her for 2 decades, told her that she was right. The winter of 1889 to 1890 began early. October brought snow in the 3rd week, unusual but not unprecedented. November brought cold that didn't ease. The temperatures dropped below 0 and stayed there. The wind came from the north in waves that seemed to grow colder with each passing day. By early December, it was obvious to everyone in the settlement that this was not a typical winter. It was severe, relentless, unusual in the way the cold descended and simply stayed. Supply trains from Kansas City had begun to struggle to get through in late November. By mid-December, they had stopped coming altogether. The railroad company made announcements that service would resume when conditions permit, but as December progressed and the temperature continued to plummet, conditions seemed less and less likely to permit anything. The general store, which relied on regular deliveries to maintain its stock, began to ration goods. Thomas Underwood announced in the first week of December that he would be limiting purchases to a half barrel of flour per family for the month. By the middle of December, he had reduced that to a quarter barrel. By late December, he was asking people to bring receipts showing what they'd already purchased, trying to prevent anyone from buying more. By early January, his store was nearly empty of the foods that actually sustained people through a winter. The settlement had believed itself prepared with the supplies it had stored in autumn, the normal stores that the community collectively made. But normal preparations proved to be dramatically insufficient for a winter this severe. Families who had followed the standard advice of the town leadership, who had stored what James Cade and the other elders suggested was adequate, found their reserves depleting at alarming rates. The children began to show signs of insufficient nutrition. The elderly became weak. By mid-January, there had been 2 deaths, one an old woman who simply seemed to give up, and one a baby who became sick and didn't recover. The community was facing a famine, a real famine, the kind that happened in towns that were truly isolated, truly cut off. And it was at this moment that people began to remember Lenora Hollis and her strange preparations. The first visitor to her door came in late January. It was the widow Henderson, whose small homestead bordered Lenora's, who had been one of the louder voices mocking Lenora at the town meeting. She came in the early evening when the sky was darkening and the temperature was already dropping toward the dangerous cold of night. Her children were with her, 2 boys and a girl, their faces thin and pinched with hunger. "Lenora," Mrs. Henderson said, and her voice was different now from the confident tone she had used when dismissing Lenora's preparations. "I need to ask if you might be willing to help. My children, they're hungry. Not just regular hungry, but I don't have enough grain. I've been rationing, but—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Lenora looked at the woman's face, at the shame written across it, at the desperation behind her eyes. She thought about what her grandmother had told her, about the ones who laughed being the ones who would beg. And she felt something that surprised her. Not satisfaction, not vindication, but a profound sadness. "Come in," she said. "Let me feed your children." Over the course of February and March, more people came to her door. The farmer who had mocked her at the feed merchant's visit came with his family, asking if Lenora might have grain to sell. She didn't sell. She gave. She gave to Mrs. Henderson and her children. She gave to the farmer's family. She gave to 3 other families whose reserves had run completely dry. She gave carefully, measuring out portions that would sustain people through the next weeks without depleting her own stores more quickly than she had planned. And word spread through the settlement that Lenora Hollis had food, that she had prepared adequately, that she was willing to help neighbors who faced starvation. The transformation in how she was regarded happened gradually at first, then all at once. People who had mocked her began to thank her quietly. Others, the ones who hadn't been to her door with desperate children and hungry families, began to ask if they might purchase supplies. Lenora set fair prices, not gouging, but not giving everything away either. She had her own family to protect, her own reserves to stretch across months, she couldn't predict. By late February, when the truly dangerous period was passing and supplies were beginning to move again on the railways, Lenora had distributed more than half of her preserved food stores. But she still had enough to see her family through to spring, and she had made enough money from the supplies she sold to replace much of the capital she had spent in preparation. James Cade came to her door in early March. The snow was finally beginning to melt, the cold was becoming less absolute, and he came alone on a clear afternoon when the sun was bright enough to be almost warm. Lenora was surprised to see him. She had wondered if he would ever come, or if his pride would prevent him from confronting what she had done. "I've come to apologize," he said simply when she opened the door, "and to ask where you learned what you knew." They stood in her small front room. Lenora had not invited him further in, though the courtesy would have suggested she should. "My grandmother," Lenora said. "She came from Ireland, where they knew how to survive long, hard winters. She taught me to watch the patterns of the sky and the earth. She taught me that sometimes the patterns repeat in ways that people forget, and that's when disaster comes. When people believe that their memory of what happened is longer than the actual cycles of nature." James Cade was quiet for a long moment. "I let pride guide me," he said. "I let my position and my experience convince me that I knew better than the old knowledge. And people suffered because of it. Because I spoke against you, others felt they didn't need to prepare. And they went hungry, and some of them—" He didn't finish. But Lenora understood. He meant the 2 people who had died. "You couldn't have known," Lenora said, and she meant it. "You listened to your own experience, and your own experience told you that the standard preparations were enough. How could you have known that experience wasn't enough?" "But you knew," he said. "How did you know?" "I listened to my grandmother," Lenora said simply, "and I paid attention to the sky, to the cycles, to the patterns. I tried to tell you, but you chose not to believe." James Cade nodded slowly. "I will go to the town meeting," he said, "and I will tell them that I was wrong, that your preparations were not excessive or foolish or a sign of distrust, that they were exactly what was needed, exactly what we should have understood was coming. I cannot undo the ridicule, but I can make sure it doesn't happen to you again. And I can suggest that the settlement begin to keep records of weather patterns, as you have done, and prepare accordingly for the winters that come in cycles." He paused. "Will you share your records with the settlement? Will you teach people what you know?" Lenora considered this. Part of her wanted to say no, wanted to protect the knowledge that had been her family's secret, that had made her different, and, in the end, saved her family. But she thought about the 2 people who had died. She thought about the children who had come to her door, thin and pinched with hunger. She thought about what would happen in another 20 years when this winter was forgotten, and people fell back into the habit of believing that the standard preparations were always enough. "Yes," she said, "I'll teach them. I'll share the records. And I'll teach anyone who wants to listen how to read the patterns, how to recognize when a cycle is shifting toward danger." The town meeting in mid-March was unlike any that the settlement had experienced. James Cade stood and gave a lengthy apology for having spoken against Lenora Hollis and her preparations. He explained, in front of the entire community, that he had been wrong, that he had let pride prevent him from listening to knowledge he should have respected. He talked about the cost of that mistake, the hunger, the deaths, the suffering that could have been prevented if he had believed Lenora instead of dismissing her. Then he invited Lenora to stand and speak. She did, and she told them what she knew about the cycles of severe winters, about how her family had preserved knowledge across generations, about how this particular winter had been preceded by specific signs in the sky and the behavior of animals, and the way crops had grown. She offered to teach anyone who wanted to learn how to keep weather records, how to recognize the patterns, how to prepare adequately when the signs shifted. A remarkable thing happened. Instead of continued mockery or dismissal, the settlement began to listen. The people who had suffered through hunger, who had watched their children go thin, who had dealt with the embarrassment of having to ask Lenora for help, suddenly understood viscerally what she had understood intellectually. The knowledge was not theoretical to them anymore. It was written on their bones, in their memory of hunger, in their gratitude for the food that had saved them. The farmer who had mocked her at the feed merchant's visit stood and publicly thanked her for saving his family. Mrs. Henderson stood and asked if Lenora would help her begin to keep her own records, to learn the old knowledge. Within weeks, a group of 15 women and men were meeting with Lenora weekly, learning how to read weather patterns, how to prepare adequately, how to organize community preparation in a way that meant no one would starve if another severe winter came. The remainder of the winter passed and spring came. The settlement began to recover. Supplies arrived from the south, trains began to run regularly again, and the immediate crisis passed. But something had changed in how people understood their relationship to Lenora Hollis, to the knowledge she carried, and to the old ways that most of them had been taught to dismiss as superstition. By summer, the settlement had begun to change its approach to winter preparation. There was now an official community record of weather observations. There was a coordinated system for storing community supplies in multiple locations, spread across several homesteads, so that if one storage location failed, the others would continue. There was discussion of building better structures, more efficient storage, ways to preserve food that came from old knowledge and new innovation combined. And there was a new respect in the settlement for the kind of preparation that Lenora Hollis had pioneered. The idea that true safety came not from complacency or assumption that things would always be as they had been, but from careful attention, from learning, from respect for the knowledge that had been hard-won across generations. Lenora herself, remained a quiet figure in the settlement, but she was no longer the object of mockery. When she came to market, people greeted her respectfully. When she spoke at community meetings, people listened carefully to what she said. When young couples established new homesteads in the settlement and asked for advice about preparation, they were directed to Lenora. Over the next several decades, as Lenora lived into her 70s, she became known as the keeper of the settlement's weather records, the keeper of the old knowledge. Younger women sought her out to learn how to preserve food, how to read the signs, how to prepare, and as she grew older, she trained her daughter Martha in everything she knew, ensuring that the knowledge would pass to the next generation. Thomas, her oldest son, became a farmer of note in the territory, and he always credited his mother's emphasis on preparation and careful observation for the prosperity and stability of his own farming operations. When Lenora finally died, peacefully in her sleep at 78, the entire settlement mourned her. But they also celebrated her, because they understood that she had done something more than survive a difficult winter. She had changed how the settlement understood its relationship to nature, to preparation, and to the value of knowledge that came from careful observation and the wisdom of the past. The winter of 1889 to 1890 became known in the settlement's history not as the year of the Great Famine, though it had come close to being exactly that, but as the winter that changed everything. And it was changed because one woman had listened to her grandmother, had watched the patterns carefully, had prepared when everyone else said she was foolish, and had been right. The lesson that the settlement learned, and that would continue to guide the people who lived there for generations afterward, was simple and yet profound, the ones who listen to the old knowledge, the ones who pay attention to the patterns that others ignore, the ones who prepare when others laugh. Those are the ones who survive. Those are the ones who endure. Those are the ones who do not fail in the moments when everything is on the line. Lenora Hollis was not the only person who survived the winter of 1889 to 1890. Many people survived it, including the ones who mocked her, but she was the only person who had sufficient stores to help others when everything else failed. She was the only person who could walk into her cellar and know that her family would eat well for months more. She was the only person who had trusted her own careful observation over the comfortable assurances of those around her. And perhaps, most importantly, she was the only person who had been willing to look foolish, to be mocked, to stand alone, because she believed that what she knew was true, and that what she had learned from the generations before her was worth more than the comfort of belonging to a community that had lost faith in old wisdom. The settlement eventually rebuilt its relationship with the cycles of nature, partly because of what happened during that winter, partly because of what Lenora Hollis taught, but mostly because they learned viscerally, through hunger and cold, what it meant to be truly unprepared. And that learning stayed with them, and it would save them many times over in the decades that followed, as the frontier became a settled land, and those initial pioneers became the founders of something that would last. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, the ones they laughed at are always the ones who survive. But it was in those brutal weeks of January and February that Lenora Hollis truly understood what it meant to carry knowledge that others had discounted. The cold that descended in the new year was a living thing. It didn't merely exist. It seemed to press against every wall, every crack, every thin space where heat might escape. Families who had relied on standard preparations found themselves burning through wood at alarming rates, burning furniture by mid-January when their supply of cut wood ran out and the snow prevented new cutting. The cold reached into homes and seemed to drain the warmth from bodies themselves. Old Mr. Patterson, who lived 3 homesteads from Lenora's, spent one night outside in his confusion during a fever and froze to death, despite his family's desperate attempts to warm him when they found him. The settlement began to understand slowly, and then all at once, the desperate situation they faced. It was Thomas Underwood at the general store who first began to crack under the strain. On a gray afternoon in mid-January, after he had rationed flour to yet another desperate family, he sent his son to find Lenora. "Mr. Underwood wants to speak with you," the boy said, not meeting her eyes. "He says it's urgent." Lenora went, even though she knew what Underwood was likely to ask. She found him in his store, surrounded by the visible emptiness of shelves that should have been full, that had been full just months before. He looked as though he had aged years in the 3 months since the winter had intensified. "Lenora," he said, and his voice held a note of something like desperation. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly. Do you have flour? Do you have significant stores of grain?" Lenora was quiet for a moment. She had known this moment was coming, but she had not known how she would feel when it arrived. This was the man who had sold to her without questioning, who had profited from her purchases, but who had also been standing beside James Cade when the settlement had decided to mock her. "I do," she said simply. "I have stored food. But my children must eat, Thomas. I cannot give what I don't have to spare." "I'm not asking for charity," Underwood said quickly, and there was something almost desperate in his voice now. "I'm asking as a merchant, as a man whose business is to feed the community. My family is small. My wife is sick with the cold. She's been coughing for weeks now, and she's weak from hunger. My son has asked me twice why his stomach hurts, and I don't have an answer to give him. If you have supplies, I can pay you. I can pay well. Whatever price you ask, I will pay it." Lenora felt the weight of his desperation, understood it, in a way that only someone who had watched closely for signs of crisis could understand. Because she had prepared for this exact moment, she could afford to be generous. $10 per barrel, she said. It's more than the store price was, but less than what you might ask of others. And Thomas, I want you to listen to me. Don't keep it all for yourself. Use the money you have and the flour I sell you to feed your customers carefully. Ration it so it lasts. That way, you'll have supplies even if we face weeks longer than we expect. Underwood's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you, Lenora. I made a mistake doubting you. I should have listened." It was the first of many such conversations, once word spread through the settlement that Lenora had supplies and was willing to sell, fairly, at prices that allowed her to profit modestly but not to gouge. The dynamics of the community shifted entirely. People who had mocked her, people who had been silent when she was attacked at the town meeting, people who had whispered about her foolishness behind her back. They all came to her door eventually. Some came with money. Some came asking for credit, promising to repay her in the spring. Some came simply asking if she might spare anything, their families on the edge of genuine starvation. The first family Lenora chose to help without payment was the Henderson family. When Mrs. Henderson arrived with her 3 children, her face was a map of shame and desperation in equal measure. Lenora was in her kitchen preparing a meal for her own family, a stew made from preserved meat, dried vegetables, and potatoes from her cellar, when Martha came to tell her that Mrs. Henderson and the children were at the door. "What does she want?" Martha asked, though by her tone it was clear she already knew. "She's come to ask for help, hasn't she?" Lenora looked at her daughter, this girl who had stood beside her through months of mockery, who had understood what Lenora understood without being told. "Yes," Lenora said simply, "and we're going to give it." She set down her spoon and went to the door. What Lenora saw in Mrs. Henderson's face, the desperate mixture of shame and hunger, the way the woman's shoulders were curved inward as though protecting herself from judgment, was enough to dissolve any remaining resentment Lenora might have carried about the mockery. "Come in," Lenora said. "Bring the children. It's too cold to speak at the door." Inside, seated around the kitchen table, the Henderson children's faces were thin in a way that Lenora had hoped never to see again. The youngest, a girl of perhaps 6, looked at the stew that Lenora placed before her with an expression of such intense longing that Martha had to look away. "Eat," Lenora told them simply, "as much as you want. We have enough." Mrs. Henderson's face crumpled. She looked away from her children, unable to watch them eat, unable to bear the intensity of her own shame at having come to beg from the woman she had mocked so publicly. "I don't know what to say," Mrs. Henderson whispered. "I don't know how to thank you, or how to apologize for what I said about you. I was cruel, I was stupid. And now you're feeding my children." Lenora sat down across from the woman. "I'm feeding your children because they're hungry," Lenora said, her voice kind but firm. "Not because of what you said, not because I'm proving something, not because I want you to be grateful. I'm feeding them because that's what you do when people are hungry in the winter and you have food. You feed them, that's all. The rest of it, the mockery, the shame, the pride, that's all secondary to that basic fact." She paused, watching the children eat with careful attention to their hunger. "What I need from you, Mrs. Henderson, is to learn what I know. I need you to understand that the next time this kind of winter threatens, you need to be prepared. If you survive this winter because I helped you, then I want to see you help the next person who comes to your door desperate for food. I want to see you teach your children to watch the patterns, to pay attention to the signs. That's how the old knowledge survives. By being passed forward, by being used, by being respected. Over the course of the next weeks, Lenora established a careful system for distributing supplies. She worked with James Cade, once he had publicly apologized, to identify the families in greatest need. She set up a modest trade arrangement with Underwood at the store, where he would purchase flour and grain from her at reasonable prices, and she would loan him additional supplies for him to loan to customers who promised to repay in spring. She made house visits to the most vulnerable families, the sick, the elderly, those with very young children, and ensured they had adequate food. But she did this with an eye toward sustainability, never giving away so much that her own supplies would run dangerously low, always measuring carefully against what she would need to feed her own family until spring. Thomas, her oldest son, watched this process with growing admiration. He had been embarrassed by her public mockery, had internalized some of the shame that the settlement had tried to heap upon his mother. But as winter deepened, and he saw the direct results of her preparation, his own family eating well while others went hungry, he began to understand what she had understood all along. One evening in early February, as they sat together in the kitchen, Thomas said to his mother, "I was angry at you in the fall, when everyone was laughing. I thought you were making us look foolish." Lenora looked at her oldest son, this boy becoming a man, and she felt a complex mixture of emotions. "And now?" she asked gently. "Now I see that you weren't foolish," Thomas said. "You were right. You prepared because you knew something was coming, and you were right. And that took courage. Everyone else was comfortable, and you were uncomfortable. And you stayed uncomfortable and kept preparing anyway, because you believed in something they didn't believe in." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was firmer. "I want to learn what you know. I want to keep records like you do. And when I have a farm of my own, I want to prepare the way you've prepared." Lenora reached across the table and took her son's hand. "Then you understand," she said. "That's all I ever wanted. For you to understand that true strength isn't in going along with what everyone else believes. True strength is in following what you know to be true, even when you're alone in believing it." The turning point in the settlement's perception of Lenora came not at a town meeting or through a public announcement, but through the quiet work of feeding people day after day, week after week, without complaint and without any demand for gratitude. As February progressed and the cold continued unabated, more families had depleted their stores entirely. The general store had run out of new supplies to distribute. The hunting had been unsuccessful. The game had moved south or found shelter and would not come out into the killing cold. Families were genuinely facing the prospect of not having enough to eat for the remaining weeks until spring. It was in this context that Lenora's door became, for many families, the difference between survival and starvation. She received visitors almost daily, some she knew well, some she barely knew, all of them in varying states of desperation. She fed them. She gave them flour to take home. She negotiated carefully with people about payment, accepting money from those who had it, accepting promises of labor or payment in kind from those who didn't, and occasionally simply giving supplies to families who could offer nothing and had nothing. The cumulative effect of these small acts of mercy was a profound shift in how people regarded her. The woman who had been mocked became the woman who had saved them. The woman who had been called a hoarder became the woman who had shared generously. And the knowledge that Lenora had been trying to protect them with, the old knowledge about cycles and patterns and preparation, became something they could feel in their bodies, something they could understand, not through intellectual argument, but through the visceral experience of having been hungry and then being fed. In mid-February, during a particularly brutal stretch of cold, where the thermometer stayed well below zero for nearly 2 weeks, a child died of illness in one of the families that Lenora had been helping. The boy, 7 years old, had developed a fever and then a cough, and despite Lenora's efforts to give his family extra food rich with nutrients, despite her attempt to help his mother nurse him back to health, the fever had broken his body and he had died in the night. Lenora sat with the family through the wake, brought them flour and cured meat for the funeral gathering, and helped dig the boy's grave in the frozen ground. It was grueling, terrible work. The earth was so frozen that it took 6 hours of careful digging and heating with hot water to create a grave deep enough. Lenora worked alongside the boy's father and brothers, and she wept as they lowered the small coffin into the ground. When it was finished, the boy's mother, a woman named Sarah Whitmore, whose family Lenora had been supplying with grain for the past 3 weeks, took Lenora's hand. "If it weren't for you," Sarah said, "this child would have died from hunger instead of sickness. At least he had enough to eat. At least that much we can know." Lenora had no words adequate to the moment. She simply held Sarah's hand and wept with her. Understanding that her preparation had perhaps extended the boy's life by weeks, understanding that it had not been enough to save him, understanding that this was the reality of frontier life, that preparation and knowledge and care could do only so much against the forces of nature and illness and death. By the time March arrived and the true severity of the winter began to ease, Lenora's cellar had been reduced significantly. She had distributed food to at least 30 families throughout the settlement, had sold supplies at fair prices to the general store, had helped keep Thomas Underwood's business functioning through the crisis, and had ensured that no one in her immediate knowledge had starved to death. There had been other deaths. Old Mr. Patterson from the cold, the Whitmore boy from illness, and an infant born to a family who didn't have adequate nutrition during the final months of pregnancy. But these deaths represented a much lower toll than might have been the case if Lenora had not prepared and had not shared. In early March, when the weather finally began to moderate and the cold began to lose its absolute grip on the settlement, Lenora took inventory of what remained in her cellar and in the buried caches. She had enough to see her family through to May, enough to have a small surplus to trade or sell. But more importantly, she had something else. She had the knowledge now, written in her records and in the memories of the settlement, that preparation was possible, that old knowledge worked, that patience and careful attention to patterns could save lives. The apology that came from James Cade was as much about this realization as it was about any specific moment or admission. When he knocked on her door on that clear March afternoon, his face showed a man who had been changed by the experience of hunger, by watching his community suffer, by realizing that his proud belief in modern progress and community cooperation had left them unprepared for the forces of nature. "I've been thinking about what you said during the town meeting," Lenora told him as they sat in her front room, "about how you learned from your own experience that the standard preparations were enough. I want you to know that I don't blame you for not believing me. You had experience that taught you something, and I had experience that taught me something different. The difference was that my experience came from my family, from people who had watched weather patterns across centuries. Your experience came from 2 harsh winters that the settlement survived. But the patterns you didn't see were the patterns that happened every 20 years or so, the catastrophic winters that took generations to develop, and then came suddenly when the community had forgotten they were possible." Cade nodded slowly. "I understand now," he said. "I've spent the past weeks watching you distribute food, watching families survive because you had prepared. I've realized that my responsibility as a leader meant that I should have listened to you, should have taken your knowledge seriously, even if it challenged my own understanding. What will you do now, when the winter passes? Will you continue to prepare?" "I will," Lenora said, "because the patterns don't change. Every 20 or so years, or perhaps every 30, this kind of winter will come again. The settlement will forget. People will become comfortable again and believe that the modern age has changed the fundamental forces of nature. And then, when it comes, people will be surprised all over again. So yes, I'll continue to prepare, and I'll continue to speak about what I know, and I'll teach anyone who wants to learn." She paused, considering something. "But I would also ask that you help me, that you use your authority in the settlement to legitimize this knowledge, that you make space for it in how the community prepares. Because if the knowledge has to be carried by just one person, it dies with that person. But if it becomes part of how the settlement understands itself, how we prepare, how we teach the young people coming in, then it survives. Then it's resilient. Then the next time the crisis comes, everyone will remember, and many people will be prepared, not just one woman with a cellar full of grain." The town meeting in mid-March was when everything changed publicly and definitively. James Cade stood, and with visible effort admitted his error. He spoke about his pride, about his unwillingness to listen, about the cost of that unwillingness in hunger and death and suffering. He spoke about Lenora's foresight, her preparation, her willingness to share and help when the crisis came. He spoke about the old knowledge and how it had been born from the experiences of ancestors who had lived through crises that the current generation had forgotten. And then he did something that surprised many in the room. He suggested that the settlement formalize the keeping of weather records, that they create a community system for storing supplies in distributed locations, that they invite Lenora to teach anyone who wanted to learn about the signs of severe winters and how to prepare. Lenora herself spoke, briefly and with characteristic lack of flourish, about what she knew and why she knew it, about how she had tried to warn the settlement and been dismissed, and about her willingness to teach. Then came something that even more powerfully shifted the perception. The families that Lenora had helped began to stand and speak. Mrs. Henderson stood and described how Lenora had fed her children when they were literally starving. Thomas Underwood stood and talked about how Lenora's supplies had allowed him to serve his community and maintain his business through the winter. The farmer who had mocked her stood and apologized and described how Lenora's help had kept his own children alive. One after another, families spoke, and their voices carried the weight of lived experience, the weight of having been saved, the weight of gratitude that could not be denied or dismissed. By the time the meeting ended, the transformation was complete. Lenora Hollis was no longer the mockery of the settlement. She was the person who had understood what others had failed to see, who had acted with courage and foresight, who had shared generously when the moment of crisis came. The knowledge she carried, the old knowledge, the knowledge passed down through generations, the knowledge of reading patterns and preparing and trusting what you had learned despite the comfort of those around you. That knowledge was now recognized as having value not just in theory, but in the concrete saving of lives. The remainder of the winter, as Lenora's supplies helped the settlement stabilize, and survival became assured, became a time of learning for those who wanted to learn. Lenora met regularly with a growing group of people interested in weather patterns, in preservation techniques, in the old knowledge that had seemed so irrelevant just months before, but now seemed essential to understanding how to live sustainably on the frontier. She showed them her records going back years, explaining the patterns she had noticed, teaching them to observe the sky, the behavior of animals, the way the crops grew. She showed them how to preserve food using the old techniques: the salt, the drying, the burying, the sealing with beeswax and pitch. She taught them about the deep knowledge of cycles, about how nature worked in patterns that humans either recognized and adapted to or ignored at their peril. Thomas began to spend more time with her in these sessions, asking questions, beginning to develop his own observational practices. Martha became her mother's closest student, learning everything Lenora knew with the focus and dedication of someone who understood that this knowledge was being passed to her as a trust for the future. Young Samuel, at 9 years old, was perhaps the most profound student because he had no prejudice against the old knowledge. He had grown up watching his mother prove that she was right, and so for him, the knowledge had always been legitimate.